In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the streets were lined with manicured lawns, freshly painted fences, and flower beds that bloomed in perfect coordination with the seasons. It was the kind of place where families moved to escape the noise of the city, where children rode their bikes in cul-de-sacs, and where neighbors nodded politely while retrieving mail from their boxes. On the surface, it seemed like the picture of suburban harmony. Yet beneath the polished veneer, small cracks of tension often ran deep, waiting for the right moment to split open. One of the biggest sources of that tension was a woman named Karen. Known among residents for her relentless scrutiny of other people's lives, she took it upon herself to enforce not only the rules of the homeowners association, but also her own unwritten standards of conduct. She was the kind of neighbor who measured the height of hedges, noted the number of cars parked in a driveway, and called the HOA president when a trash bin was left out an hour past collection time. Her presence was a constant reminder that peace in the neighborhood could be shattered with the stroke of a complaint. It was during a warm summer weekend that Karen's next crusade began. The air carried the scent of charcoal, the crackle of flames, and the unmistakable aroma of sizzling meat. One of the families down the street, the Thompsons, had decided to host a barbecue in their backyard. Invitations had spread informally, neighbors were stopping by, and the sound of laughter mixed with music carried over fences and hedges. For most, it was a welcome break from routine, but for Karen, it was an offense that demanded action. From her vantage point behind the blinds of her living room window, Karen watched with narrowing eyes. She noticed the cars parked along the curb, the clusters of people gathering, and the faint thump of music carried by the summer breeze. She convinced herself that this gathering was not just a casual party, but a violation of community peace. Her mind tallied the supposed infractions: noise past acceptable limits, street congestion, and potential rule violations about hosting events on residential property without prior approval. The more she fixated, the more justified she felt in escalating the matter. As the barbecue continued, the atmosphere at the Thompsons' home grew more cheerful. Children darted across the lawn. Adults stood around the grill with plates in hand, and the mood was one of neighborly connection. Even residents who rarely socialized had stopped by, drawn in by the smell of food and the sound of laughter. The gathering was far from wild, but in Karen's mind, every cheer and every song was evidence of disorder. She began pacing her kitchen, muttering under her breath about the rules she knew so well. To her, the neighborhood wasn't supposed to feel like a block party. It was supposed to remain orderly, serene, and strictly controlled. As the music grew slightly louder, she decided that patience was no longer an option. She reached for her phone, her finger hovering for only a moment before dialing the non-emergency police line. When the operator answered, Karen painted a picture of chaos. She described the scene as loud, disruptive, and possibly unsafe. She hinted that parking congestion could block emergency vehicles and suggested that alcohol might be involved. Her words framed the gathering as a disturbance that needed immediate attention, and she requested that officers be dispatched as soon as possible. When the call ended, she felt a rush of satisfaction, convinced that she had once again taken action to preserve the neighborhood's dignity. Meanwhile, at the barbecue, no one suspected what was coming. The laughter grew louder, the smoke curled higher into the air, and the evening sun began its slow descent, casting golden light across the backyard. For the Thompsons, it was shaping up to be one of those summer evenings people would remember fondly. The camaraderie of neighbors sharing stories, the smell of grilled food, and the joy of children running freely made it feel like the essence of community. But as the first patrol car quietly turned onto the street, the tone of the night was about to change. Karen stood by her window once more, her lips pressed into a thin smile as the flashing lights reflected faintly off the glass. She imagined the scene that would unfold: officers stepping into the backyard, the party ending abruptly, neighbors chastised for their lack of consideration. She anticipated apologies, embarrassment, and perhaps even fines. For her, It was not merely about peace and quiet, but about reinforcing her place as the guardian of order in the neighborhood. What she did not know, however, was that the officer assigned to respond to her call was no stranger to the Thompsons. In fact, he was one of their closest friends. His arrival was not destined to bring shame upon the hosts, but rather to spark a chain of events that would expose Karen Au's pettiness in a way she had never anticipated. As the car slowed to a stop and the officer stepped out, the neighborhood stood at the edge of a shift. What had begun as a simple backyard barbecue was about to become a story whispered across lawns and sidewalks for months to come. Karen's decision to involve the police was meant to silence a party, but instead, it would ignite a drama that would ripple far beyond that summer night. And with that, the officer closed his car door and began walking toward the source of music and laughter, setting in motion the next chapter of the neighborhood's unfolding conflict. The officer approached the backyard with an easy stride, the kind of walk that carried both authority and familiarity. The Thompsons, in the middle of serving another round of food, noticed his arrival almost immediately. But instead of worry flashing across their faces, their expressions shifted into wide smiles. Plates were set aside, and a few of the guests waved enthusiastically, welcoming him like a guest, rather than fearing him as an enforcer. For Officer Daniels, this was not just another call. He had grown up with Mr. Thompson, shared countless memories with him, and considered the family more than just neighbors. They were close friends. Seeing their backyard full of happy faces, music, and laughter made him feel as though he had stepped into a celebration rather than a situation requiring intervention. Still, his presence in uniform carried weight, and the party grew momentarily quieter as guests took notice of him. Daniels reassured them with a smile, a nod, and a wave of his hand, making it clear that he was not there to disrupt the fun. Quiet murmurs spread among the guests as they realized the officer was not a stranger, but someone deeply connected to the hosts. For the Thompsons, the tension they might have felt dissolved instantly, replaced with relief and amusement. On the other end of the street, Karen remained glued to her window, her eyes locked on the scene unfolding across the lawns. She expected to see the officer delivering stern warnings, perhaps even demanding that the music be shut down and the crowd disperse. Instead, what she saw made her stomach tighten with irritation. The officer was laughing, shaking hands, and even accepting a plate of food from the grill. Rather than enforcing her vision of order, he seemed to be blending seamlessly into the gathering, her hand clenched around the edge of her curtain. From her perspective, it looked like the rules were being ignored right in front of her. She had made the call to restore peace, but the peace was already there, just not the kind she wanted. To her, the neighborhood was slipping into chaos, and the very authority she counted on was participating in it. Back at the barbecue, Daniels listened to the concerns of a few guests, who jokingly mentioned the possibility of Karen's call. Everyone knew of her reputation, and the idea that she had been the one to summon the police was more amusing than alarming. Daniels, still mindful of his duty, took a moment to step aside and survey the scene with a professional eye. He saw families enjoying themselves, children supervised, no excessive noise, and cars parked neatly along the curb without blocking driveways. In short, there was nothing to warrant official action. He decided his response would be measured but firm. He would file the necessary note about the call but mark it as unfounded. To him, the bigger issue wasn't the barbecue, but the neighbor who couldn't tolerate it. And as he enjoyed a brief moment at the grill, he silently acknowledged that this incident was part of a larger pattern. Karen's complaints weren't about rules. They were about control. The night continued with renewed energy. The guests felt vindicated by the officer's presence, and the laughter grew louder, carrying an undertone of defiance. It was no longer just a barbecue. It was a statement. The neighborhood had gathered to enjoy each other's company, and no amount of complaints could strip that away. Daniels eventually excused himself, giving the Thompsons a nod of reassurance before heading back to his patrol car. But his visit had left a mark, one that would echo louder than Karen expected. Karen, meanwhile, paced her living room, muttering about favoritism and negligence. She convinced herself that the officer's friendship with the Thompsons had clouded his judgment, that the rules had been ignored because of personal connections. Her mind spun with thoughts of bias, corruption, and unfair treatment. If the authorities would not uphold her view of order, she would have to find another way. In her frustration, she began drafting an email to the HOA board. She carefully outlined her grievances: noise levels, cars on the street, and the unauthorized event that had taken place. She referenced the bylaws, highlighted passages she believed were being broken, and painted a picture of a neighborhood slipping into disorder. For Karen, the email was her next weapon, a formal complaint that could not be ignored. The irony was that outside her window, the barbecue was still in full swing, brighter and livelier than before. Guests lingered under strings of lights, conversations spilled across the lawn, and the sound of clinking glasses floated into the night. The community spirit that Karen despised was thriving in spite of her efforts, and her isolation deepened with every burst of laughter she overheard. The barbecue ended late into the night, with neighbors leaving in high spirits and promises of future gatherings. For many, the evening had reinforced a sense of connection, a bond strengthened by the knowledge that even a police visit had not dampened their joy. For Karen, however, the night ended with a bitter taste of defeat. Her plan to restore control had failed, and worse, her target had been shielded by authority itself. But the story was far from over. Karen's frustration was not something that would fade quietly. Instead, it would drive her toward more drastic actions, ones that would escalate the conflict far beyond a single summer barbecue. The lines had been drawn, the resentment had taken root, and the stage was set for the drama to grow. As the neighborhood settled into silence, Karen's glowing computer screen was the only light left burning on the street. She hit send on her carefully crafted email to the HOA board, unaware that her attempt to regain control would spark a chain of events even she could not anticipate. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Karen's email had already landed in the inboxes of every HOA board member. Her words were sharp and calculated, painting a picture of recklessness and disregard for the rules. She described the barbecue as an unauthorized neighborhood disturbance, emphasizing noise complaints, congestion on the street, and alleged safety concerns. She even included a line suggesting that the police response had been compromised by personal bias, hinting that favoritism had allowed the Thompsons to escape accountability. The HOA board, accustomed to her frequent complaints, read through the message with weary resignation. Karen was known for flooding their inboxes with grievances about everything from overgrown grass to misplaced holiday decorations. But this email carried an edge of determination that set it apart. It was not simply a matter of annoyance. It was an attempt to escalate the issue into official territory. Reluctantly, the board agreed to place it on the agenda for their next meeting. News of Karen's email spread quickly, thanks to a few board members who confided in their friends. By midday, whispers were circulating throughout the neighborhood. People spoke in hushed tones over backyard fences and during casual strolls down the street. The idea that Karen had not only called the police but was now involving the HOA board stirred a mix of outrage and amusement. For many, it confirmed what they already knew. Karen's need for control was boundless. The Thompsons, meanwhile, were still basking in the afterglow of their successful barbecue. They laughed over the night's events, replaying the moment Officer Daniels had joined in as the highlight of the evening. But as neighbors stopped by to share snippets of gossip about Karen's email, their amusement gave way to concern. They had no intention of breaking rules, but they also knew how persuasive Karen could be when she weaponized the HOA bylaws. By the time the HOA meeting rolled around a few days later, anticipation hung over the neighborhood like heavy air before a storm. Residents packed into the community clubhouse, their presence less about governance and more about witnessing the unfolding drama. Karen arrived early, clutching a folder stuffed with printed bylaws and highlighted passages, her expression stern with purpose. The Thompsons sat toward the back, calm but wary, while others filled in seats and lined the walls, eager to hear how the confrontation would play out. When the meeting began, routine matters were addressed first: budget updates, landscaping contracts, and maintenance schedules. But everyone was waiting for the inevitable moment when Karen would raise her hand and demand the floor. And, as expected, she did. With deliberate precision, she launched into her speech. Her voice carried the conviction of someone who believed she was the last line of defense against chaos. She detailed the noise, the parking, and the so-called party atmosphere that had invaded the neighborhood. She accused the police of negligence and hinted at a conflict of interest, her words dripping with insinuation. She demanded stricter enforcement of community rules and proposed new measures to prevent unauthorized gatherings from happening again. The room listened, but the atmosphere was not one of support. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, a few rolled their eyes, and quiet murmurs of disapproval spread. For many, her complaints had gone too far. They had attended the barbecue themselves, seen firsthand that it was harmless, and found her portrayal exaggerated at best. When she finally sat down, there was a ripple of tension, as though the entire room was waiting for someone to challenge her. That someone turned out to be not the Thompsons, but another long-time resident, Mrs. Patel, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. With calm authority, she reminded the board that community was built on connection, and that the barbecue had done more to strengthen bonds than weaken them. She pointed out that the event had caused no real disruption, that cars had been parked respectfully, and that the noise had ended at a reasonable hour. She even mentioned how the presence of Officer Daniels had reassured everyone that nothing inappropriate had taken place. The applause that followed was spontaneous, and it carried weight. The Thompsons felt a surge of relief as neighbor after neighbor spoke up, each offering their support and dismissing Karen's claims as overblown. For once, the room was united, not in fear of Karen's scrutiny, but in resistance to it. Karen's face tightened as the tide turned against her. She shuffled the papers in her folder, trying to reassert authority, but the momentum had shifted. The board members, clearly swayed by the overwhelming support for the Thompsons, politely thanked Karen for her concerns, but declined to take further action. They noted that the event had not violated any specific bylaws and emphasized the importance of fostering community spirit. For Karen, the meeting ended in humiliation. She left the clubhouse with stiff shoulders, her folder clutched tightly against her chest. Neighbors watched her go, their expressions ranging from pity to quiet satisfaction. She had intended to assert control, but instead, she had isolated herself even further. The Thompsons, on the other hand, walked home that evening with renewed confidence. They had not only defended themselves, but had seen the neighborhood rally around them. The experience solidified their place in the community and exposed Karen-ass influence as weaker than it had once seemed. But even as laughter and relief spread through the neighborhood, an undercurrent of unease remained. Karen was not the type to accept defeat quietly. Her sense of authority had been challenged, and her credibility had been damaged. In her mind, this was not the end, but merely another battle lost in a war she was determined to win. Alone in her home, Karen sat in silence, staring at the stack of bylaws on her kitchen table. The sting of public rejection burned deep, but it also fueled her resolve. She would not allow herself to be ridiculed, nor would she permit the neighborhood to slip into what she saw as disorder. If the HOA board would not take action, then she would find another way. And as the neighborhood returned to its routines, few realized that Karen's next move would be far bolder, far more personal, and far more disruptive than a simple email or a call to the police. The days following the HOA meeting were unusually quiet on Karen's street, but beneath the calm exterior, resentment simmered. For most residents, the matter was settled. The barbecue had been defended, the community had spoken, and the HOA had declined to pursue any action. Yet for Karen, the sting of humiliation had only deepened. Each time she stepped outside to collect her mail or water her plants, she felt the weight of neighbors' glances. Some ignored her entirely, others smirked knowingly, and a few openly exchanged jokes at her expense. To Karen, every glance was proof that she was being ridiculed. Her authority, once unchallenged in the neighborhood, was slipping away. For years, she had wielded the bylaws like a sword, cutting down any perceived disorder with quick complaints and sharp words. But now, her attempts to control had backfired, exposing her as petty rather than protective. The HOA's dismissal felt like betrayal, and the support the Thompsons had received only reinforced her sense of isolation. Karen began to retreat into her home, spending hours rereading the bylaws, searching for loopholes she might exploit. She pored over every clause, every subsection, looking for a technicality that could justify her complaints. But no matter how deeply she dug, the truth was inescapable. The barbecue had not broken any rules. Her frustration grew as she realized that her power was waning, and with it, her ability to command respect. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the Thompsons chat with passing neighbors, her resentment hardened into resolve. If official channels would not support her, she would have to act on her own. She convinced herself that her actions were not out of spite, but out of duty, that she alone had the vision to maintain order in the neighborhood. Her thoughts became consumed with the idea of taking matters into her own hands, of proving that the Thompsons were not as innocent as they seemed. Her first step was subtle. She began keeping a detailed log of their activities. When cars arrived, how long guests stayed, when lights turned off, even the volume of music drifting through the air. Every small detail was meticulously recorded in a notebook, which she told herself would serve as evidence of recurring disturbances. But observation alone was not enough. Karen wanted action, something that would remind the Thompsons and the entire neighborhood that she was not to be dismissed. Late one night, after pacing her living room for hours, she finally decided on a plan. She would create disruption not by enforcing rules but by crafting the illusion of rule breaking. Her target was the Thompsons' reputation. If she could not catch them violating the bylaws, she would make it appear as though they had. In her mind, this was not deception, but strategy, a way of restoring balance in a community that had turned against her. The first attempt came in the form of anonymous complaints. She mailed unsigned letters to the HOA, alleging that the Thompsons were hosting frequent late-night gatherings, disturbing the peace, and violating noise ordinances. She even hinted at the possibility of alcohol being served to underage guests, a baseless accusation but one designed to stir suspicion. While the HOA did not act immediately, the presence of the letters added a layer of unease to the board's discussions. At the same time, Karen began spreading whispers among her closest acquaintances in the neighborhood. Casual conversations at the mailbox or while walking her dog became opportunities to plant seeds of doubt. She suggested that the Thompsons were trying to turn the neighborhood into a social hub, that their gatherings were increasing, and that it was only a matter of time before property values began to decline. Her words were carefully chosen, designed not to sound like gossip, but like concern. Yet despite her efforts, the Thompsons remained largely unaffected. Their relationships with neighbors were strong, strengthened even more by the barbecue incident. If anything, the rumors only rallied more support around them, as residents saw through Karen's attempts to discredit them. The community spirit she despised was thriving, and her own reputation was sinking further into distrust. Frustration pushed her toward more desperate measures. One night, after ensuring no one was watching, she crept onto the Thompsons' property and snapped photographs of their backyard. Her intent was to capture evidence of code violations, an overfilled trash bin, a misplaced lawn ornament, anything she could use as ammunition. But in her eagerness, she failed to notice a security camera mounted discreetly on the side of the house. The lens caught her in clear view, standing with her phone raised, trespassing on private property. The following day, the Thompsons reviewed the footage and were stunned. What had begun as annoyance at Karen's complaints was now escalating into harassment. They saved the footage, knowing it could become crucial if her behavior continued. For now, they chose not to confront her directly, preferring instead to keep the evidence in reserve. Meanwhile, Karen felt emboldened. The photographs she had taken were hardly damning, but to her they represented proof of her vigilance. She organized them into a folder alongside her notebook of observations, convinced that she was building a case. In her mind, it was only a matter of time before the HOA would have no choice but to acknowledge her warnings. But the reality was starkly different. Neighbors were growing increasingly wary of her presence, avoiding her gaze and crossing the street to escape conversations. Whispers of her late-night prowling began to spread, and suspicion mounted that her obsession with the Thompsons was bordering on unhealthy. Instead of isolating the Thompsons, she was isolating herself. And still, she pressed on. Each night she sat by her window, watching, waiting, and writing in her notebook. Each day she looked for opportunities to undermine the Thompsons, convinced that persistence would eventually pay off. What she could not see was that her actions were pushing her further into a corner, setting the stage for a confrontation that would leave her with far less control than she had ever feared losing. The neighborhood had once tolerated her strictness, even respected her dedication to order. But now, with every move she made, Karen was not just losing influence. She was becoming the very disruption she claimed to be fighting against. And as the tension continued to mount, it was only a matter of time before her obsession reached a breaking point, and the neighborhood would be forced to choose once and for all where their loyalty truly lay. As summer deepened, the tension in the neighborhood thickened like humidity in the air. The barbecue had become a story retold in driveways and whispered during evening walks, each retelling casting Karen as the antagonist in a drama that was quickly slipping beyond her control. For the Thompsons, life carried on almost normally, but beneath their calm surface they remained wary. They knew Karen was not finished, and the footage of her trespassing sat saved on their computer, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. Karen, meanwhile, had convinced herself she was winning. Each late-night observation, each note in her logbook, each whisper of doubt she attempted to sow, fed her belief that she was tightening her grip on the neighborhood S narrative. She failed to notice that her efforts only fueled distrust, that her name had become synonymous with trouble rather than authority. Neighbors avoided her not out of fear of her complaints, but out of exhaustion from her relentless fixation. One evening, a week after she had crept onto the Thompsons' lawn, Karen decided to escalate again. She had been stewing over the lack of response from the HOA board and the indifference of her neighbors, and she resolved that the only way to make her point was to create a spectacle. She imagined exposing the Thompsons publicly, catching them in the act of violating rules, and using that moment to reclaim her role as enforcer of order. She set her sights on their next gathering. The Thompsons had invited a handful of families over for a casual evening, a far smaller event than the barbecue, but enough for Karen to see an opportunity. As dusk settled and laughter drifted across the fences, Karen prepared herself. With her phone fully charged, she slipped outside, determined to capture footage of evidence she could later present. From the shadows of her own yard, she recorded snippets of the gathering. Children playing tag, adults chatting with drinks in hand, music playing at a modest volume. To anyone else it was harmless, but Karen framed every detail as incriminating. She muttered to herself about noise violations, about unapproved structures when she zoomed in on a canopy, about potential hazards when she caught sight of the grill. Her mind twisted ordinary images into proof of chaos. Yet again, she overlooked the Thompsons' security cameras. They recorded her pacing along the property line, angling her phone through gaps in the fence, even leaning over slightly to get a better view. The footage captured her behavior in startling clarity, her obsession laid bare for anyone who might see it. The Thompsons noticed her presence almost immediately. Guests exchanged uneasy glances as Karen's silhouette shifted near the fence. Whispers spread among them. She was watching again, recording again. Rather than confront her outright, the Thompsons decided to let the cameras tell the story. They remained composed, refusing to give her the reaction she craved, but privately, their patience was running thin. The next morning, the footage was shared quietly with a few trusted neighbors. Within hours, word spread. Phones buzzed with the video showing Karen lurking, recording, intruding into a gathering that was peaceful and innocent. The reaction was swift and unanimous. Outrage. People who had once tolerated her strictness now saw her as intrusive and unstable. Conversation shifted from annoyance to concern, from eye-rolling dismissal to serious discussions about harassment. By the end of the day, the Thompsons had made their decision. They filed a formal complaint with the HOA and provided the security footage as evidence. The complaint was detailed, citing not only her trespassing but her ongoing harassment, false accusations, and disruptive behavior. Copies of the anonymous letters she had sent were also included, tying the pattern of obsession together. The HOA board, faced with undeniable proof, could no longer ignore the problem. At an emergency meeting, they reviewed the footage, the complaints, and the growing unrest among residents. For the first time, the focus was not on the Thompsons, but on Karen herself. The board agreed that her actions had crossed a line, violating the very rules she claimed to protect. Word of the complaint spread quickly, and neighbors rallied once more, this time not in defense of the Thompsons, but in unified resistance against Karen's behavior. Families who had stayed neutral before now voiced their frustrations, recounting their own encounters with her endless scrutiny and unsolicited lectures. The tide had fully turned. Karen, however, was oblivious at first. She continued to patrol her windows, to jot notes in her logbook, convinced that the evidence she had gathered would soon vindicate her. But when she received notice from the HOA requesting her attendance at a disciplinary hearing, her certainty began to crack. She read the letter twice, then 3 times, her hands trembling as the words sank in. She was no longer the accuser. She was the accused. The irony was unbearable. For years, she had positioned herself as the guardian of the neighborhood, the one who enforced the rules when others were too lax. Now, the very system she had relied on was turning against her, using her own behavior as grounds for reprimand. She felt cornered, betrayed, and yet, in some twisted way, vindicated, convinced that everyone else was conspiring against her because she had dared to hold them accountable. The days leading up to the hearing were filled with unease. Neighbors whispered about what might happen, speculating whether Karen would be fined, stripped of her HOA privileges, or even taken to court. The Thompsons, though weary of the drama, prepared themselves to face her one last time, knowing that the outcome would shape the neighborhood's future. And as the date of the hearing approached, Karen's resolve hardened. In her mind, she was not defeated. She was preparing for battle. She gathered her notebooks, her photographs, her recordings, every scrap of paper she believed would prove her case. She convinced herself that the truth was on her side, that the neighborhood was blind to the disorder around them, and that only she could restore control. What she did not realize was that the hearing would not be the vindication she imagined. It would be the breaking point, the moment when her obsession was exposed in full and the neighborhood would finally decide her fate. The night of the hearing arrived with a tension that felt heavier than any previous HOA meeting. The community clubhouse was filled to capacity, neighbors spilling into the back of the room and lining the walls. It was rare for so many to attend, but the spectacle of Karen A.'s confrontation with the board had drawn them like moths to a flame. What had started as a backyard barbecue weeks ago had snowballed into the defining conflict of the summer, and now everyone wanted to witness the resolution. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat with folders stacked in front of them. Inside were copies of complaints, anonymous letters, bylaws, and most damning of all, the footage of Karen trespassing and recording her neighbors. The evidence was undeniable, and the board members' expressions reflected the seriousness of what they were about to address. Karen arrived, clutching her own folder, thick with notes, photographs, and highlighted bylaws. She walked stiffly, her chin held high as though she were the only person in the room with the courage to defend what was right. Neighbors averted their eyes, not out of respect, but out of discomfort. Many had once tolerated her presence. Some had even humored her vigilance, but now she stood as an outsider in the very community she claimed to protect. The proceedings began calmly, with the board outlining the purpose of the hearing. They explained that Karen's behavior had raised serious concerns, citing multiple reports from residents and the submission of video evidence. The screen flickered as the footage played. Karen creeping across the Thompsons' lawn at night, camera phone raised, peering over fences, pacing along the property line. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The sight of her lurking in the shadows confirmed what many had suspected but few had seen firsthand. Karen's face flushed, but she did not falter. When it was her turn to speak, she launched into a speech rehearsed in her head for days. She insisted that the Thompsons' gatherings were disruptive, that her recordings were meant to protect property values, that her letters were a necessary warning about creeping disorder. Her words carried the same conviction they always had, but this time, the room was unmoved. The evidence outweighed her justifications, and the more she spoke, the more she revealed the depth of her obsession. Neighbors stood one by one to share their experiences. Some spoke of her unsolicited lectures about lawn care, others of her constant nitpicking over minor details, and still others of the discomfort they felt being watched from behind her blinds. One neighbor recounted how she had followed their teenage son down the street to demand he remove his baseball cap, claiming it made the neighborhood look unkempt. Another described how she had pounded on their door late at night to complain about the sound of a television. Each testimony chipped away at the authority Karen once wielded. The weight of years of grievances piled onto the table, and the picture that emerged was no longer that of a vigilant protector, but of an intrusive, overbearing presence who had driven wedges through the community. Finally, the Thompsons presented their side. They spoke not with anger, but with clarity, outlining the harassment they had endured and providing the board with a timeline of Karen's escalating behavior. They handed over the anonymous letters, the log of her late-night surveillance, and the most recent footage from their cameras. Together, it painted a picture of obsession that could no longer be ignored. The board deliberated briefly, though the outcome had become obvious. When the decision was announced, the room was silent, hanging on every word. Karen was officially censured by the HOA, fined for harassment and trespassing, and barred from serving on any committees or holding any position of influence within the association. The board also warned her that further incidents would result in legal escalation, including possible restraining orders. The silence broke into murmurs, then applause. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt free of her grip. Relief washed through the room, not because they had wanted to see her humiliated, but because they had finally reclaimed their peace. Karen sat frozen, her hands gripping the folder in her lap. She heard the verdict, felt the rejection, but refused to accept it. In her mind, she was still the victim, still the lone voice of reason in a sea of blindness. She gathered her papers, stood, and left the room without a word, her departure watched by dozens of eyes. As the door closed behind her, the tension lifted. Neighbors lingered to talk, their conversations brighter, their laughter easier. Plans for future gatherings were already being made. Block parties, holiday cookouts, casual get-togethers that now carried a new sense of unity. The conflict had been draining, but it had also forged stronger bonds among those who had stood together against Karen's hostility. Back at her home, Karen sat in the dark, staring at the bylaws spread across her table. She felt betrayed, outnumbered, cast aside by the very people she believed she was protecting. Yet beneath her anger, there was a flicker of awareness she could not extinguish. Her influence was gone. The neighborhood had turned. The HOA had rejected her, and her name had become a cautionary tale whispered with disdain. The barbecue that started it all was no longer just a memory. It had become a symbol of resilience, of a community choosing joy and connection over control and fear. For the Thompsons, it was a reminder that friendship and unity could withstand even the sharpest attempts to tear them apart. For the neighborhood, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one no longer dictated by Karen's scrutiny. And for Karen herself, it was the end of her reign. A fall brought about not by others' defiance, but by her own obsession. The neighborhood returned to peace, but the story of Karen and the barbecue would live on, retold in driveways and across backyard fences, a cautionary tale of what happens when one person mistakes control for community, and when neighbors choose laughter over fear.